Hello and welcome to Auspol Explained. My name is David, your long curly haired host. Today I've sat down via Zoom with Emily, the engagement director from Equality Australia, to talk about advocacy groups and lobbying. There are a bunch of different organisations and groups that are formed to campaign for some kind of change, be that specific or to represent a community. So what is the process actually like? What is involved? How do campaigns grow, get attention, and, well, how long do they take? Let's begin. Can you please introduce yourself and please give a brief physical description for accessibility purposes?
Hi, I'm Emily Mulligan. I'm the engagement director at Equality Australia, and I don't know, I'm a brunette and a tired mum.
You work for Equality Australia. Can you tell us what that is and what it does?
So, Equality Australia is a national LGBTIQ plus organisation dedicated to achieving equality for LGBTIQ plus people. So, whatever that might look like, there's not so many national LGBTIQ plus organisations, and they're often state based. So, that's what makes us special.
Basically, Equality Australia, it advocates for reforms for the benefit of LGBTIQ people. You've done quite a few campaigns in the past. I believe it was created in the wake of the campaign for marriage equality back in 2017, and has had a lot of other campaigns since then for a lot of state-based reforms. That's what we're here to unpack, basically. You know, how do campaigns to get the government to change something work? What is the process of reform like? You know, what does it involve?
Yeah, it's a big question, and there's absolutely no roadmap or right or wrong answer here, to be honest. But I think a few questions that I would ask myself at the beginning of any campaign or working with any organisation is whether you might want to take an inside power approach or an outside power approach. And some organisations are better placed to do one or the other. And I think Equality Australia can do both. So, what I mean by that is inside power is when you develop relationships that are really close with decision makers and politicians. You might want to get something done sort of behind closed doors, less public scrutiny. Maybe that's because your issue is really sensitive and actually public debate, say, over trans people's lives or their healthcare is not actually conducive to a good outcome. Or maybe it's because you're like the mining lobby or something, and what you're advocating for isn't particularly popular. So you might try a sort of direct to decision makers type approach. So inside power is all about access, it's all about influence, and it's often quite a bit to do with having money and resources. And then outside power is maybe when you try the more public approach. So you make sure there's public attention on your issue. You demonstrate that you have mass support behind your issue or your call. You've got support across different areas or different constituencies, and you're probably more likely that way to be able to demonstrate or secure media attention on your issue. So those are two significant and quite different approaches, and doing one often means you can't do the other. But I think another key thought or approach to making change is distilling your issue. So a lot of groups have a lot of problems they're trying to solve. For equality, for example, we know that conversion practices or conversion therapy happen. It's not something that most people are going to be exposed to, but for the people that do experience it, it's very, very damaging, and it's something that's quite unique to the communities that we represent. So in that instance, we have a problem we're trying to address, and, you know, we have a suite of policies that we know can address that problem. Another way that change can happen is like capitalizing off a scandal or public attention. Those are the moments when big change happens. An example for Equality Australia in recent times was the decision around an attempt to not include the communities or the full community in the census. It's completely impossible to predict, but for some reason that became a big national story over many weeks, and that ended up having a complete reversal of position by the government. But those moments, if you can capitalize on them, are absolutely worth their weight in gold. And then I think just the other way to think about a campaign is just representing a constituency's interests. So for us, obviously, that's whatever is most important for LGBTIQ plus people. And that will always be a suite of policies and issues that are really significant to all those people at one time. And the benefit of representing a community that large is that it's completely disparate everywhere over Australia. Almost every family will contain someone that's part of the community. And as much as they'll try and paint, the community as just a inner city group, that's absolutely not true. And data is now showing that we're at least 4.5% of Australian communities fit somewhere under the umbrella. So being able to demonstrate that you represent a significant constituency does help when you're trying to advocate for change.
So inside would be sort of like you have meetings with like government members where you can actually directly get your point across, whereas like outside is more reliance on the media. Is it possible to unpack what a kind of like inside power situation would be? There is a particular goal in mind, a reform needs to be introduced by a government minister. Does the minister be like, oh, I'm going to be making this reform, who do I talk to, like seek out groups like Equality Australia, or is it more of like the initiative of Equality Australia to try and get the foot in the door and be like, hey, out of your busy schedule, please give us some time so we can make the case as to why you should be considering this? What's the like process there and like actually communicating with a government member or minister?
Yeah, everything you said is right. At the end of the day, to change the law federally in Australia, you're going to need the votes in two houses of parliament. And when we have an election, we can determine how the cookie crumbles and who you need to get your piece of legislation through both houses. And you can always hope for sort of multi-partisan arrangements and support across the aisle. And sometimes that does happen, and often it doesn't. But at the end of the day, it's a numbers game. So that's the most important thing to analyse. I think when I start any new campaign or work on any issue, the number one question I should be asking is, who is the decision maker on this issue? And what do they care about? And who do they listen to? That's the basis, I think, for all government relations and government interactions. I think there's plenty of organisations out there that, would love and would dream of a conversation with their relevant minister. And maybe it will happen, maybe it won't. There's a few different ways to go about it. I think there's always like cultivating influence within Canberra and Parliament, maybe when the folks that are more on your side of an issue aren't in power and folks are backbenchers and they have more time and less responsibility and they're trying to get across the issues. And you can introduce yourself as credible and as nonpartisan and independent or whatever else it is. Maybe you're the Minerals Council and you're none of those things, but that would be the time to sort of build your influence and your relationships in Parliament. And then figuring out what is your strength. So as Equality Australia, we're legal policy experts. We can provide feedback on bills. We engage in sort of submission processes, inquiry processes. And through that way, you can cultivate trust as well by being sort of a sensible voice that is representative of the community that they're seeking to represent. I guess as well, being independent, being nonpartisan, it counts for a lot, just to make sure that your reputation is always one of sort of impartiality and first and foremost representing the interests of the community. There's lots of different ways that people go about it. There's like parties at Parliament House. I was in Parliament House last year and Google was running this big party, very flashy, great snacks, like wine out. There were Wiggles there. And so some companies with resources are able to do things like that, like have fun events that people really do want to be a part of. And other more community groups might just have to go through friends of friends to sort of get access or to get a meeting. But I would encourage groups of all shapes and sizes to get involved and not sit out because it's intimidating. Politicians do work for us. Contact details are all publicly available on the Parliament House website. And I just wouldn't be discouraged. They are human beings with interests and families and communities. And there's always a way to find common ground. The hard bit can be getting your foot in the door. But at the end of the day, politicians are accountable to us. So make sure you're sticking your hand up and picking up the phone and having your voice heard.
You mentioned, like, other groups like Google, for example, have a lot of resources. You mentioned the Mineral Council. There is this sort of perception, which is not entirely unfair, that there are a bunch of lobby groups that have this ability to really influence government policy and ideas, but lobbying is part of the democratic process. Everyone is allowed to lobby. It's not inherently a bad thing. For example, you are looking after a community that, as a minority, does not necessarily always have its voice heard. So, lobbying and advocacy is not inherently bad. It's just that there is, some groups and vested interests have more resources and power than others. In terms of, like, specifically your area of advocacy, there are groups that do not exactly have much resources, I think, but are on the opposite side of issues to you. Like, for example, the Australian Christian Lobby and Family Voice Australia. So do you find that, like, there's lots of interaction between those competing groups? Or is it more of just like, you have your separate agendas, you're doing your separate thing, and ultimately it ends up being just a competition for attention and influence?
Look, it's a really good question, because one trap I see people falling into time and time again is sort of trying to convince their opposition of something to change their position. It's never going to happen. That's okay. In the world, we all exist on sort of political spectrum. LGBTI liberation is on one side, and there are opponents to that, and we should just be realistic about that. Be aware of what they're doing, monitor it, monitor for trends, monitor for influence, monitor for political engagement that they're able to achieve, but run your own race is what I always say. We should be aware of them. We should never be trying to persuade or convince them, but we should have strategies that work. People can get distracted by the influence that some of these groups have. And at the end of the day, we should have strategies that should be able to withstand it. And I think in terms of LGBTI rights, I think we have the majority of Australians. I mean, we kind of know that we have the majority of Australians on board with us, and that a lot of Australians maybe just don't even think about these issues, and that's fine. We don't need every single person on board. We need select decision makers in parliaments across Australia to help break down the barriers in the way of LGBTI people living free and equal lives. And so if we can stay laser focused on those fights and targets and bills and pieces of legislation, then we can win and we can make people's lives better. I think we can make sure that we win over those people in the middle as well. I think there's a tension as well in campaigning between having polished campaign plans and timelines and agendas and key moments mapped out versus what happens in reality, which is the only thing you can really predict is complete unpredictability. So you need to just be able to adapt. If timelines blow out, happens all the time, especially once you're engaged in a government process. So maybe a bill's been drafted but hasn't been consulted on yet, or it's been pushed to the next sitting period, or it's been pushed for another inquiry. Like these timelines drag and drag and drag, and that doesn't mean you've lost, but it does mean you may have to adapt how you're working and just keep across if your opponents are having more influence, if they're engaging in some trickery, like sometimes you can be almost at the end of a campaign, bill's gone out for a vote, and then there's like some parliamentary process trickery happening, or more delays of sort, or there's plenty of tactics in the final stages of a bill getting passed. So there's a lot to be aware of. You need to have your policy agenda really watertight and defensible and in a state that's going to make a positive difference to a lot of people's lives. But then you also have to be alive to the absolute minutiae of how a bill is going to get passed. So if you stay focused on the policy outcome rather than all of the different pieces that are happening out in the world that are relevant and could sway a campaign one way or another, then that's a way to stay focused, I think, and make sure you're responding to the things that really matter.
Well, speaking of like the passage of a bill, you mentioned inquiries, and yes, sometimes a particular reform can take quite a while. I feel like people have this sort of impatience at governments of being like, there's a problem, fix the problem, but there is a lot of consultation involved. It could be committee inquiries that could take 12 months of gathering evidence before tabling a report, and then the ministers then consider that information. So I had a question about like that kind of consultation process. How are the details of a reform developed? Like you said, lots of people are on board with the idea that like LGBTQI plus people deserve better protections and better outcomes. How exactly that is achieved in terms of policy and legislation, that is the kind of detail that needs to be worked on, and people need to be consulted. So how much is it like developed by, say, like an advocacy group like Equality Australia ahead of time and presented like, here are our recommendations? Or is it more of just you're trying to get the government to consider the issue, and then the government decides to maybe consult you afterwards and goes, here's our suggestions, what are your thoughts? Like
chicken or egg?
What's the development process like? You've got an idea that you want to see happen, they've got an idea they want to see happen, other groups have an idea. How does it all work?
Few communities are blessed with, I guess, being a priority for a government from day one. Governments come in with their agendas, and sometimes your community may be a priority and they're coming to you and they're asking questions. That's a wonderful position to be in. And on some issues like health, that's certainly been our experience this term of government. So not to throw shade unnecessarily, but I would say for most community groups, and I'd say it's true of LGBTI people, that there is fight to get onto the agenda to begin with, and that's a fair bit of work. And then in terms of figuring out what we're asking for, in the LGBTI space, connection to community is essential. There's no sort of group of chosen folks who are able to dictate what the community says or wants or requests. So it's definitely a connection to community, working with stakeholders, large-scale surveys, research when necessary, work with other peak bodies, you name it. It happens to make sure that the suggestions that are going forward are coherent, backed by the community, and really going to make a difference to people's lives and are seen as a priority by the community. So there's, I think, nothing worse than maybe if a community group does win a substantial piece of funding or a campaign ask that the community is not really supportive of. Not a great position to be in either. So it's a lot of, again, distilling the issues, finding out what's important, what are the solutions that would work, In Equality Australia's case, we really specialise in that legal policy and legal analysis so that we're able to, provide drafting for bills, provide feedback, engage in the submissions processes, collate a lot of feedback from the community and distill that into how it might change a law. I guess that really does open up the question then to when you might accept something that is progress over the complete package that the community would like, and when you might accept some compromise. And that's always an ongoing and spirited debate, I think, in the community. I guess the other thing that is important to note is that sometimes stopping a bill or maintaining the status quo is the win. There's a lot of conversations and debates and constant garbage on Sky News around, trans people and their puberty blockers are coming for you. In fact, maintaining our access that we have now across Australia would actually be a substantial win for the years moving forward, in that we have great systems that need more support and funding at the moment. Yes, sometimes a tremendous campaign victory might be, maintaining the status quo rather than something new and shiny.
You mentioned, it is a fight sometimes to just be on the agenda. That is quite true. Marriage equality, that was heavily publicised. A lot of the campaigns that you've been involved in have not been heavily publicised. You mentioned earlier, like the census that surprisingly was in the news for weeks. Circling back to the idea of outside power, the media, ideally for any kind of campaign to work, you'd like to get media attention because that's a way to make sure that people know that it's happening, influence people's ideas, start conversations, and also encourage other people to also contact members of parliament. So really, how do you get media attention? Is there like a strategy for like coming to the media and trying to create a story, or is it, luck of the draw?
So I think as a national advocacy group representing LGBTI people, we get asked to comment on, you name it, this, that, and the other that might be related to the community. Some of it we're able to respond to quickly, and then you've got a story in the media with an advocate's point of view. The other way that you mentioned, like trying to make a story out of nothing, is very, very difficult indeed. That can take weeks and months, actually. And what it often requires is someone willing to share their trauma, essentially. Those personal stories are what connects with people at the end of the day. I don't think we've evolved too much beyond just being storytellers. And so to get some of our issues onto the agenda, like things like discrimination in religious schools, which can be hard to explain. It's a tricky policy area, like discrimination law is like really complex. We're never going to get a media story on even the politics or the policy of discrimination. However, when people can show losing their job, being expelled, being reprimanded one way or the other just because they're gay, now that's a story. And the more shocking details in there, the better, in terms of what a journalist is looking for to print a story. Unfortunately, I would say many of our key campaign goals do really require people to open up in that way. And, that's a very, very big ask. And we're sort of aware of that. When we're talking about things like conversion practices or vilification against the community, you are actually asking people to share trauma, violent events, really horrible things. But that's the approach when it comes to securing media on issues that otherwise wouldn't have any airtime.
Well, that's a bit bleak.
And you can use your own channels increasingly, right? Our own social media, the reach can now be phenomenal, especially with video. So, and that way people can do it in a more trusted environment, but at the same time, it's still sort of the same essential ingredients.
Part of your campaigns involve inviting people to send emails to their elected representative or sign a petition. Often people are unsure what to write, so you have, email templates. And really, I want to know, I suppose lots of people would like to know, given, the time frame. Remember, the time frame of how this is a lengthy process, and sometimes, the time between being like, hey everyone, let's send these emails, and some tangible difference happening can be very far apart. So my question really, is all of this effective?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's a tough question because it's hard to measure. And if you're maybe like the education minister, I'm sure you're getting so many of these messages a day. But I know in the MPs that I speak to at different levels, if they get even a handful of messages on the same topic, it'll be spoken about the next day. It is incumbent on every MP to be responsive to their stakeholders and to their constituents. So you will be heard, and maybe not every form letter will be completely taken into account, but I also don't think it's incumbent on every individual to be across policy details of the things that they care about. And that's why advocacy organisations help by providing those dot points and providing people with the opportunity to take action on issues that they care about. They do matter. They are listened to. They're probably spoken about with a little bit more disdain than people would like, in people's offices. But I do think they matter a great deal. And I can tell you, when we were advocating for the Equality Bill in New South Wales, which was a suite of reforms that help LGBTIQ plus people in New South Wales live better and easier lives, we know that that our opponents were advocating in huge numbers, and we were hearing about it all the time in Parliament. And so when there were impassioned letters, people's personal stories, and local constituents writing to their MPs, it mattered a great deal to making sure that LGBTI voices were counted too.
How can people get involved? Every person can write an email or contact an MP, but you're an organisation, there are multiple ways to support an organisation. How can people find advocacy groups that align with their values, and then how can they support those advocacy groups?
We're out here, so follow everyone that you care about on social media and just look for opportunities to get involved. If you have the opportunity or it's the right fit, if you could ever consider sharing your story, it's among the most powerful things that you can do. We haven't actually grown past the old-fashioned idea of a phone tree. So if you're someone that everybody knows can call 50 people or is connected to 50 people in your community, that is an incredibly powerful thing to offer to an organisation. Someone that's like well connected, can ask for favours, will respond quickly. That's an absolute powerhouse, and someone that would be called upon a lot for any issue that you care about, and whatever community it might be, like your local community, any online community, the community that you're part of in your identity in whatever way. If you're someone that is well connected within that community and can mobilise and activate, that's incredibly powerful. It has been, I think, since the dawn of time. And how they used to organise in the 70s was calling trees, where one person called one person and everyone had someone else to call. And that's how we could that people mobilised big marches and big mobilisations before they had the internet. But I think the concept remains. So absolutely write your emails, sign up for updates, stay informed, join social media communities if you can, donate, and just get involved however you can.
Thank you very much for your time and expertise. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, David. Appreciate it. Have a good one.
Well, you heard Emily. get involved. Find an advocacy group or lobby group that represents your interests and help support them to ensure that you can stay up to date with campaigns, contribute to them, and also, get other people involved so they too can help contact members of parliament and get those reforms done. Members of parliament, they represent you, and it is up to us all to ensure that they represent our interests. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode. Share, subscribe, and don't forget to comment down below something supportive and nice. As we all know, whenever anything to do with LGBTQI+ people is mentioned, people can get very nasty in the comments. But if you say anything mean in the comments, I will just delete it, because that is garbage. Don't say that. And thank you so much to my supporters on Patreon, who get access to episodes early, a couple of bonus content things, and also just help me afford, inevitably one day, a secondhand electric car. That's right, that's a genuine thing. Anyway, thank you so much, I'll see you next time.